It began with the sound of tires skidding over gravel and a shriek that cracked the morning like lightning, splitting a calm sky. 1 second I was holding a spatula over the griddle, coaxing the last pancake into shape, and the next, Karen's SUV was skidding up the private road like a rhinestone-decorated bulldozer. She wasn't supposed to be here. Legally, only 2 properties had access rights to this road. Ours and another owner half a mile down. Karen's was not one of them. The vehicle skidded half onto our gravel path, half onto the native grass my wife had carefully replanted for months. The crooked, defiant parking job set the tone. She wasn't here to comply. She was here to dominate. Out of the car emerged Karen herself, flip-flops slapping against the earth as if she was trying to stomp the mountain into obedience. Her oversized sunglasses glittered like the crown of some self-appointed monarch, and her body language screamed, "You live under my rules. You better come out now, or I swear I'll sue your face off," she screamed, pointing at our porch as though it had personally insulted her. My wife, still in her robe and sipping coffee, didn't even flinch. She muttered softly, almost amused, "And so it begins." I stepped outside, spatula in one hand, robe tightened around me, torn between irritation and disbelief that my Saturday morning was about to become a theatrical HOA showdown. Karen had been circling ever since we bought this cabin 6 months ago, even though we had deliberately chosen it because it was outside of her HOA jurisdiction. We bought a sanctuary, a no HOA zone tucked deep in the pine-covered slopes. The listing itself had proudly advertised no HOA. That was freedom. That was why we were here. But to Karen, our independence was an unforgivable sin. Her voice rose, shrill and cutting, spouting accusations about bylaws, property lines, and violating the visual peace of the mountain. My wife set her mug down, walked to our heavy steel gate, and without saying a word, she closed it with a resounding clang. Then she locked it. The sound seemed to strike Karen where it hurt most, in her illusion of power. For the first time, she looked stunned, frozen in the realization that her clipboard of rules didn't cross this line. My wife picked up her phone, calm and composed as ever, and dialed. "Hi, yes," she said pleasantly. "There's a woman trespassing again. Same SUV, same screaming, slightly different shade of crazy." Karen's sunglasses slipped slightly down her nose, and behind them I could see her expression falter, as though she was computing an equation that didn't make sense to her. In her world, outrage equaled authority. On our land, outrage equaled nothing. Then came the delicious irony. Her SUV, in her haste to storm the gates of injustice, was now parked entirely inside our property line. My wife's eyes flicked to the vehicle and then back to me with the faintest of smiles. Revenge, it seemed, sometimes wrote its own poetry. When Sheriff Davis finally arrived, Karen was pacing, making frantic phone calls to whoever still tolerated her dramatics. The sheriff stepped out of his cruiser with the patience of a man who had already resigned himself to the story his retirement barstool years would be filled with. He took one long look at Karen, listened to her rant about mountain ambiance, and turned to us. "What's the story this time?" he asked wearily. My wife handed over our gate camera footage. Everything. The SUV barreling up the private road, Karen stomping in, shouting threats. The sheriff watched silently and sighed in a way only law enforcement veterans can, shoulders dropping, temple rubbing, like he'd just watched the climax of a bad sitcom for the 10th time. Karen was quick to pivot into her usual theatrics. First tears, then sputtering threats of fines and HOA sanctions, then fantastical claims that the road was historically communal. Her grandfather had apparently once driven cattle through it in the 1960s, which she claimed gave her some spiritual rite of passage. The sheriff stared at her as if she had just suggested the moon was made of gluten-free banana bread. "Ma'am," he said in his gravelly voice, "this is private property. You've been warned already. There are no violations here. What there is," he tapped the metal gate lightly, "is trespassing and obstruction." He told her plainly that she could be looking at fines or even court charges if she persisted. Karen's voice broke into a pitch that even the birds in the trees didn't appreciate. "You fenced me in? You trapped me," she shrieked. "Not yet," I replied, glancing casually toward the post-hole digger leaned against the shed. "But I might." Karen paled, eyes darting between the sheriff, my wife walking back toward the shed with the calm of someone choosing dessert, and the rolls of fencing stacked nearby. Sheriff Davis tried and failed not to smirk. "Technically," he said carefully, They can build a legal fence on their own land. If your car happens to be on it, he left the implication hanging in the air like mist. Karen gasped as the reality of her miscalculation crushed down on her. For years, she had lived where her intimidation worked. But today, she had parked her power trip inside a trap she had built for herself. As Davis wrote down his notes, the scene quieted. My wife returned to her coffee, sipping like it was just another peaceful mountain morning. Karen, suddenly reduced from tyrant to trespasser, stood muttering about cheat codes and laws of spirit before finally retreating to her car, slamming the door so hard it rattled the glass. The sheriff turned back to us as if to say, "This isn't over. Be ready for more." And he was right, because this wasn't the end of Karen's crusade. It was just the opening volley. The morning after Karen's SUV fiasco, the woods returned to their usual rhythm, birdsong rising like nothing had happened. But the peace felt thinner now, like smoke after a fire, proof that flames had been there even if the air was quiet. My wife and I sipped coffee on the porch, comfortable in our silence, yet both thinking the same thing. She'd be back. People like Karen didn't retreat. They reloaded. Sure enough, by midday we opened the mailbox to find a formal letter, unsigned but reeking of her energy. It was printed on cheap printer paper in Times New Roman with accusations, ranging from malicious fencing intent to spiritual endangerment of community landscapes. My wife read it aloud in the voice of a courtroom actor, adding dramatic pauses until we were laughing too hard to take it seriously. Then she dropped it into the fire barrel like it belonged to the kindling gods. Still, her laughter didn't hide the truth we already knew. Karen's obsession had mutated from petty neighbor to zealot. This wasn't about property lines anymore. It was about her pride. The next week proved it. Suddenly, fake violation notices began appearing nailed to our fence post. Each bore a forged HOA logo that looked like it had been designed by a child with clip art. One accused us of aggressively rustic landscaping. Another said our wind chimes violated mountain tranquility. Third claimed our solar panels disrupted visual heritage. We didn't bother responding. We just filmed myself reading them aloud for the security footage, because if this circus ever made it to court, we wanted the whole show on record. Then came the odd visits. A lawn care truck we hadn't called rumbled up the drive, insisting we had scheduled them for regulation trimming. My wife asked who sent them. "Cho," they said confidently. We explained again that we weren't in the HOA. They drove off bewildered. A day later, a teenager in a polo shirt with a clipboard arrived and announced he was here for a mandatory cabin inspection. We asked for identification. He stammered, claimed he was from the Mountain View HOA Enforcement Committee. When my wife pressed further, asking which county authorized him, he paled and scrambled down the driveway like his polo had caught fire. Again, we caught it all on camera. That footage turned out to be gold. Later that evening, we uploaded it to a private neighborhood forum we'd quietly joined. It turned out we weren't alone. Replies flooded in from other landowners sitting just outside Karen's HOA zone. "She did the same thing to us," wrote one. Another uploaded a PDF cataloging incidents like an amateur FBI file, complete with screenshots of the same blocky fake violation letters and timestamps of her inspections. Reading through it all felt like discovering a secret underground railroad, but for people escaping HOA tyranny. For the first time, we realized we weren't just surviving lunacy. We were part of something larger. A quiet rebellion was forming, connected by irritation and memes shared at Karen's expense. My wife printed a giant aerial map of the area, color-coding every property boundary. She laminated it, posted it on our gate, and taped a simple note beneath. "This is where your authority ends. This is where our patience ends too." 2 days later, Karen herself drove past slowly, rolling down her window to squint at the map. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the twitch of her face when the bright yellow highlight showed just how far her HOA boundary stopped, half a mile before ours began. The look she wore was the same as someone being told gravity wasn't optional. But when humiliation failed, she did what she always did: escalate. That week, we received our first thick envelope from a law office, official headers, stamped copies, and a 12-page letter filled with phrases like emotional pollution of community, spirit and psychological warfare via aggressive fencing. We laughed again, right up until she claimed we were infringing on her historic ingress rights from an abandoned cattle trail. My wife squinted at the words, then muttered, "So now she's invoking ghost cows." I called our attorney, who laughed so hard he had to put me on hold. "Don't worry," he said once he caught his breath. "That claim is as dead as the cows she's imagining. She's grasping at whatever illusions she can find." Still, we took no chances. We double-checked the county archives ourselves and pulled everything we could find on easements or right-of-way. The records were clean, glaringly so. No easements, no ancient cattle routes, no backdoor HOA jurisdiction. Our land deeds were ironclad. Karen's case, if she even had one, was built entirely on fantasy and audacity. My wife, never one to miss the chance to lace defiance with humor, walked into town and returned with a custom-made wooden sign. In perfect script it read, "Money private property. Not under HOA. Do not engage in delusional governance." She propped it by the gate like it was art. Karen came back later that afternoon, clipboard in hand, squinting at the sign for a long time before taking a photo with her phone and retreating with the sulkiness of someone who knew she'd just been roasted in permanent wood. We thought that might be the end for a while, but at 2 a.m. the very next night our motion cameras lit up. There she was, cloaked in a hoodie, gloves on, creeping toward the gate like a teenager TPing someone's lawn. She tugged at the sign, fumbling to pry it loose until she spotted the blinking red camera. The footage caught her eyes wide, then her flip-flop sprint back into the dark. By morning we sent Davis the clip titled, "Subject attempting unauthorized sign removal. Repelled by blinking light." He replied with a single line, "You two are quickly becoming my favorite cabin owners." We laughed, but even little victories carried weight. We had learned Karen's cycle. Humiliation became aggression, aggression became retaliation. It was only a matter of time before her storm escalated again. And unlike her, our responses weren't tantrums. They were documentation, evidence. Our fence posts still lay stacked by the shed like soldiers waiting for a call to battle. And as I stared at them, coffee steaming in my hand, I felt the shift clearly. This wasn't about surviving Karen anymore. It was about finishing what she started, drawing a line not just in wood and wire, but in patience and law. The rolls of fencing material had been waiting by the shed for weeks like silent allies, and after Karen's midnight hoodie stunt and her absurd ghost cow ingress letter, we knew the time had come. The fence wasn't just a project anymore. It was a statement. So, one crisp morning, armed with post-hole diggers, wooden panels, and the quiet determination of people who had finally had enough, we began. My wife measured the first stretch with care while I set the posts. Each thud of the mallet into the earth sounding less like construction and more like punctuation. This is our line. Karen, of course, appeared before noon. Her SUV crept up the edge of the road and then stopped. She didn't storm in this time. No shrieks, no threats. Instead, she sat there with binoculars, watching, waiting. We could practically hear her engine ticking as she snapped photos of us hammering the posts into place. My wife looked up once, waved cheerfully like we were headlining a home improvement show, and went back to her work. Karen didn't wave back. She just clicked her phone, then scribbled on a clipboard like a raccoon filing a police report. By day's end, we had finished one side of the property, deliberately saving the section near the gate, the very spot her SUV had once intruded, for last. It wasn't strategy exactly, more like poetic timing, and we knew Karen couldn't resist. Sure enough, the next morning she returned, only this time she'd brought backup. A man in a suit and tie, sweating under the mountain sun, lugging a briefcase far too shiny to be useful. He strutted up to the half-finished fence like it was his moment. "You are constructing an illegal barrier on shared land," he bellowed, as though raising the volume made up for the lack of an actual license. He rattled on about emergency access and federal open road doctrine, hurling terms that didn't belong in any real law book. He shouted long enough for my wife to finish bolting a panel and then finally interrupted him with one simple question. "What state are you licensed in?" The man faltered instantly. "Well, I'm acting in a community legal advisory role." "So not a lawyer," my wife said flatly, leaning on the new fence post with her usual calm. She raised her phone and hit record. The man, realizing he'd just walked directly into evidence collection, muttered something about slander and retreated toward Karen, who looked stunned that her legal muscle had folded faster than a camp chair. She retaliated the only way she knew, by screaming, "You fenced in my car. That's entrapment." "Wrong again," my wife said evenly. "Your car was trespassing on our land. That makes it evidence, not property." We worked on plank by plank. At one point, Karen's SUV horn blared in defiance. A long, frantic beep like the sound alone could undo the geometry of our land deed. But the sheriff had already confirmed. The fence was legal, and if her car happened to be inside it, that was her burden to bear. Later that afternoon, a tow truck rumbled up. For a split second, I thought she'd actually found someone reckless enough to cross property lines. The driver ambled forward with his clipboard, eyeing the locked gate and the giant private property, no HOA jurisdiction sign we'd added. I asked him, "Here to pick up a car?" "Yeah," he said with a shrug. Lady on the phone kept yelling, said her car was trapped by some rogue fence builders. "Where is it?" I pointed toward the gate. "Behind here, on private land." The driver studied the sign, glanced at our cameras, then shook his head. "Nope, I don't trespass. Not for $50. Not for 500. He tipped his cap and drove back down the hill, muttering something about needing hazard pay for HOA drama. Karen's face when he refused was worth framing. That night, as the fence rose stronger and straighter around our land, we didn't throw a victory party or hang banners. We just sat on the porch sipping cider, admiring the elegant line it created. It wasn't spite. It wasn't rebellion. It was quiet defiance. A barrier that spoke clearly in wood and wire. No further, but Karen wasn't finished. Of course not. The following day, a sleek black car pulled up with county plates. Out stepped a man in khakis and a golf shirt, clipboard in hand. "We received an anonymous tip," he said officiously, "about illegal construction obstructing drainage flow." I nearly choked laughing. We were on a hill. The only thing draining here was Karen's patience and sanity. My wife calmly retrieved our stamped permit for non-permanent fencing, handed it over, and let the man squirm. He nodded reluctantly, shuffled his clipboard, and drove away. From the tree line, Karen's head ducked back, caught like a child eavesdropping with a juice box. By week's end, the fence stood tall and complete, strong, legal, undeniable. Karen's SUV remained on the inside of its boundary like a caged relic of her arrogance. To us, it wasn't just a construction project finished. It was a transformation of air and space. What once had been a blurred line of intimidation was now a wall of clarity. For the first time since she'd barreled up that road, we finally breathed easy. But Karen, she only seethed harder. And as we watched her pace beyond the locked gate the following evening, muttering furiously into her phone, I knew this war wasn't over. The fence was only Act 1. Her real meltdown was still coming. By the time the fence stood firm, Karen was wobbling on the edge of reason, and everyone knew it. For weeks she had raged at the gate like a storm with flip-flops, mouthing threats, calling fake inspectors, and even waving her phone around like it could magically create laws. But when the tow truck refused to help her, when her community lawyer folded under one question, when her SUV sat locked within our fence like a monument to her arrogance, she snapped. It started with the night raids. Our cameras caught her slipping through the pine trees at ungodly hours, wrapped in hoodies, fumbling with screwdrivers at the fence brackets as though she were James Bond on discount night. One clip showed her yanking hopelessly at a welded post, whisper screaming to herself about illegal structures, until our motion lights flicked on and froze her mid-tug. Watching her sprint back into the woods like a raccoon with a guilty conscience would have been comical if it weren't so absurd. Still, we didn't confront her. We logged every second, sent the files to Sheriff Davis, and waited. Then came the headlines. After one midnight stunt ended with her tripping on a tree root and face-planting directly under deputy lights, the sheriff arrested her for trespassing. The local paper ran a small column titled, "Trespasser Attempts Self-Rescue Fails Dramatically." It wasn't Pulitzer material, but the community devoured it. Neighbors passed the clipping around like contraband candy, chuckling, whispering, relieved that someone had finally forced consequences Karen couldn't blackmail away. But humiliation fuels revenge, and revenge lit her fuse. Within a week, we received a thick stack of papers from a real law firm. Karen had escalated from fake HOA citations to filing an official lawsuit against us. The charges? intentional infliction of emotional distress, unlawful detainment of private vehicle, and my personal favorite, psychological warfare by construction. Reading it was like flipping through the script of a courtroom comedy that hadn't yet hit theaters. My wife poured a glass of wine, stood by the fire, and read the complaint aloud with mock gasps and courtroom dramatics. By the second page, we were laughing so hard our sides hurt. Still, absurdity alone doesn't guarantee a win. You need to show the receipts. And we had them. Every fake notice, every forged inspector, every 2 a.m. hooded trespass, every deputy report. More footage of Karen than National Geographic had of mountain lions. Our case wasn't just strong, it was bulletproof. The courtroom was packed the morning of the hearing. Word had spread like wildfire, and locals, tired of years of Karen's reign of petty terror, filed in with the kind of giddy anticipation usually reserved for pancake breakfasts and rodeos. Even Sheriff Davis showed up, leaning against the back wall with arms crossed, smirking like a man waiting for the best show in town. Karen arrived in oversized sunglasses, dragging a beleaguered attorney who looked like he regretted every choice that led him to this job. She slumped dramatically into her chair like Queen on trial, sighing loud enough for half the room to hear. Her lawyer started with a rehearsed opening about harassment, emotional harm, and neighbors weaponizing property lines as instruments of cruelty. Then it was our turn. My wife stood with quiet confidence, slid a flash drive into the courtroom monitor, and hit play. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Karen's own voice, shrieking through our gate, blocking our driveway, filing fake notices, creeping across our fence line in the dead of night, muttering about spiritual jurisdiction under the gaze of motion sensors. At one point, the video showed her sprinting into the woods after spotting the blinking red camera, flip-flop flying off like a white flag of defeat. The room rippled with suppressed laughter. The judge raised her hand sharply for order, though even she fought to keep composure. When the final clip played, Karen screaming, "You can't trap me in a box of steel and arrogance." You could practically hear the gavel winding up in the judge's fist. The questioning was short. The judge looked over her glasses at Karen. "So your vehicle was on their private land without permission?" Karen tried to explain, babbling about spiritual rights, ghost cattle trails, and historic road usage. The judge interrupted. "Was the car moved, damaged, or tampered with?" Silence. "Did the defendants notify law enforcement during each alleged incident?" Sheriff Davis gave a single ceremonial nod. The judge sighed, removed her glasses, and set them down with finality. "This is not a real case. This is a tantrum, dismissed." The gavel came down so hard it echoed like a thunderclap. Karen's attorney buried his face in his palms. Karen stood stunned, mouth opening and closing like a fish dumped on a hot dock. Cameras from the local press flashed as she stormed out, sunglasses crooked, shrieking about conspiracies and persecution. That afternoon, the HOA board released an official statement. Karen was permanently removed from all positions, her voting privileges suspended, and an internal review launched into every action she'd taken during her reign. The community that once tiptoed around her tantrums finally exhaled. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was a punchline. But sitting on our porch that evening, sipping coffee under the quiet of the mountain, my wife and I both knew it wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about a shift in balance. For the first time in years, the community wasn't scared of Karen. They were laughing at her. And nothing is deadlier to a tyrant than becoming a joke. Still, we didn't let our guard down. Karen wasn't finished completely, not yet. People like her don't disappear. They linger, scheming for some shred of control. But if she ever tried to return, the difference now was clear. She'd face not just us, but a whole community no longer willing to be ruled by her clipboard of nonsense. After the courtroom debacle, life on the mountain shifted in a way you could feel in the air. The tension that used to hang around like fog was gone. No more surprise SUVs barreling up the road. No clipboard notes taped to doors. No weird fake inspectors mumbling about visual harmony. The silence we now enjoyed wasn't the prelude to another battle. It was the reward that follows one. Karen hadn't packed up and moved. Her house still stood half a mile down the slope. But the war was over because the weapon she wielded best, fear, had finally broken. She was no longer the barking enforcer of bylaws. She was a punchline whispered with laughter at the general store. The community, which had once tiptoed around her outbursts, seemed to finally breathe freely. Neighbors began reaching out. A retired carpenter named Greg came by with a handwritten invitation to something called the Freedom from Karen Festival. At first, my wife and I laughed, assuming it was just a joke. But within days, people we'd never formally met were dropping desserts, coolers, and lawn chairs at Greg's yard in preparation. The jokes turned into plans, and the plans turned into something remarkable. One Saturday night, nearly 60 people gathered around a roaring bonfire. Some wore t-shirts doctored with slogans like Community 1, Karen 0, and Fences Fix Everything. Others brought food, guitars, and drinks, creating a party not just of celebration but of exhaling years of pent-up frustration. We hadn't planned to speak, but eventually someone handed my wife a microphone and the crowd chanted her name. She stepped forward with her calm poise, laughed lightly, and said, "All we really did was read the listing description, build a fence, and refuse to let someone else rewrite reality. Anyone here could have done it." Cheers erupted, drinks raised in toasts, and the fire crackled higher. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. Turns out all it takes to stop tyranny is a gate and a camera. That line drew the loudest laughter of the evening, layered with an undeniable sense of relief. People were letting go of the fear that had ruled them for years, replacing it with humor and shared freedom. Stories poured out that night like beer from a cooler. One neighbor described how Karen once fined him for hang-drying clothes, calling it offensive to mountain aesthetics. Another had been ticketed for having a trampoline, even though his land lay beyond HOA maps. A man pulled out a framed letter she'd given his family that read, "Porch rug violates reflective harmony." Passing it around, people roared with laughter until tears streamed down their faces. It was comical, yes, but also cathartic. The very absurdities that once silenced neighbors were now jokes they could laugh about together. And laughter is the sharpest blade against tyranny. Back at our cabin, though, one loose end remained. Karen's SUV. By then, the once imposing beast had sat behind our fence so long it had practically turned into yard art, a monument to her miscalculation. With the lawsuit dismissed and the legal waiting period complete, we filed the paperwork with the county declaring it abandoned. A flatbed truck came a week later. We watched as it loaded the SUV and hauled it down the road, disappearing into a dust cloud. Something inside us loosened in that moment, the knot untying on months of absurd conflict. My wife, never one to leave symbolic space barren, looked at the ruts her tires had left behind and said, "Why don't we turn it into a garden?" At first I thought she was joking, but she meant it, and it made perfect sense. The spot where Karen had parked her Defiance was the perfect place to plant something alive, something gentle. So we cleared the soil, laid in compost, and planted lavender, rosemary, and wildflowers to attract butterflies. In the exact center, we planted a cherry tree. Around it, we placed 4 stones, each engraved with one word: boundaries, respect, patience, peace. What had been the ugliest scar in our land was now healing, blossoming into something beautiful. Meanwhile, the HOA itself was forced into reform. The board, embarrassed by Karen's meltdown, passed new transparency rules. Some even jokingly dubbed them the Karen Clause. Now, no complaint could pass without hard evidence, no surprise fines without photos and documentation. At one town session, a new board member even quipped, "If your complaint starts with 'I just feel like,' it doesn't qualify anymore." The residents laughed, not cruelly but with release. Control had been replaced by logic. Fear turned into accountability. We didn't attend those meetings. We preferred our sanctuary just beyond HOA lines. But word reached us. Neighbors we'd once only exchanged nods with now dropped by with pies, bottles of wine, or just to say thank you. What started as our battle had become the community's liberation. Our fence was nicknamed the Line of Sanity, and our gate became a local landmark, referenced in online neighbor groups as a story of triumph. Someone even uploaded our saga to a legal humor blog, which crowned it a top 10 petty legal wins of the year. We chuckled at that, reminded again that sometimes all you need is patience, cameras, and persistence. Autumn came quickly, blanketing the mountains in amber leaves. Unlike the autumn just months before, this one felt tranquil, rooted, free. No more surveillance from SUVs at the road. No screaming that shattered morning coffee. Just the rhythm of our lives returning quietly. My wife gardened with her straw hat tilted against the sun. I chopped wood in peace, took walks without watching over my shoulder, and even napped on the porch without feeling like someone was peering through binoculars. We played music in the evenings without fear. For the first time, our cabin truly felt like the sanctuary we bought it to be. And in the spring, the cherry tree bloomed, pink petals unfurled, scattering over the lavender, drifting like confetti from a victory parade we never threw. We stood side by side, hand in hand, watching it in bloom. The garden wasn't an act of revenge. It was closure, proof that something gentle could grow from madness, that dignity could triumph over delusion. Karen hadn't apologized, not openly, but her silence since the court case was louder than any of her screams. She was still there, living down the hill, but she wasn't feared now. She was just another neighbor, muted by reality. Maybe that was the ultimate legacy. Not that we beat her, but that we reminded everyone around us that boundaries matter, peace matters, and that sometimes the loudest statement of all is the quiet life you build after the noise has faded.